Welcome everyone. Hello. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes before we get into it, just because I'm still waiting for people to log on. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully everything's okay. As you've noticed, I'm in a different room today, so hopefully you can hear me just as well as usual. My name's Holly. I am currently an NHS assistant psychologist. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. And today we are going to talk about the Rolfe et al. 2001 reflective model, one of the most common reflective models. And also, if any of you are watching, hoping for doctorate interviews this year, it's a really good model to use in interviews and for interview prep as well. Welcome back to Clinical Psychology Community UK. As I say, we are on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and obviously we are on YouTube. So give us a follow and a subscribe, and you can get all of the updates as well. So we are 1 minute past 6. We are going to get started then. Let's get straight into it with the Rolfe et al. Model. So today we are going to talk about, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to reflective models. I'm going to outline the model that we're going to talk about, the Rolfe et al. 2001 model. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'm going to critique the model as well, so some positives and some negatives, some strengths and limitations. And then we're going to have a little time for a question and answer section. So as we go through, if you've got any questions, absolutely pop them in the chat, and hopefully I can get to it in the question and answer section. Then I'll talk a little bit about our upcoming webinars. I've got a really exciting live webinar for you next month as well, related to the doctorate, and then how to get involved. So looking a little bit at reflective models, I'm not going to talk for too much about this, for too long about this, because I've done a video on reflective practice in clinical psychology that lays a lot of foundation. So I'll make sure I link that down below as well. A reflective model then, what is it? I mean, it sounds really fancy, but don't be panic at all. It's not that fancy. It's essentially a framework, and it helps you think about experiences in different ways. They often have prompts and questions that guide the way that you think about things and the way that you reflect on things. It has origins in different disciplines. So, obviously there's psychology. Some of the models come from education settings, some come from nursing, some come from occupation and employment psychology and well-being arenas. There are as well a little bit of shameless plugging, I have to admit, and there are some full webinars available on the YouTube channel. Particularly, we've got reflective practice in clinical psychology, which was the first webinar we ever did back in August. And there's one on reflective portfolios, and there's different videos on lots of different reflective models. All right, so if we're going through tonight and you think, I'm not sure this model's for me, that's all right. There will be one out there that is, and I've probably done a video on it as well. So have a little look on the YouTube channel. So thank you. Okay, let's get straight into it then. The Rolfe et al. Model. The broad structure follows a lot of different models. Okay, they usually follow the same structure, and that is what, so what, now what. Now, if you've ever watched any of our other videos, the Driscoll model uses this. There's loads of other models that use these broad 3 questions in that structure. What's different about the Rolfe model, the Rolfe et al. Model, is that there are different questions for each section, if you like. So the what section has lots of different questions. The so what section has lots of different questions and prompts, and the same with the now what section. So this model originally was written regarding reflective practice in nursing. So not psychology. This one did come from nursing. But it's really applicable to psychology and our clinical experiences. Let's start by looking at what then. So what? And all of the questions start with what, as you might imagine, in this category. So what is the problem or the difficulty or the reason for feeling stuck or feeling bad, not getting on? What is the core issue here? What is it? And it's like what it's prompting you to do is give a description of that problem. What was my role in the situation? What was I trying to achieve in the situation? What actions did I take? And what was the response of others? That's quite helpful for helping you kind of step outside and, adopt someone else's viewpoint, if you like, to walk in someone else's shoes and try and think how others were responding to the situation at the same time. What were the consequences for myself, from others, for clients? I should say, actually, because this came from nursing, the terminology they use is patients, Whereas in psychology, I'm very much of the school of thought that we should use clients rather than patients. So I've changed the wording to clients because that's what fits better for me. So what were the consequences for myself, for the others, for clients? What feelings did it evoke in myself, or others, or clients? And what was good or bad about the experience? So you might be sitting there thinking, whoa, that's a lot of questions to be asking me when I'm doing a reflection. That's a lot of stuff to consider. Absolutely it is. So this is a model that I use when I am feeling stuck or there's some difficulty in the situation. It's not a model I use when something's gone well and I want to reflect on that. It's really something about when things feel sticky and difficult. That's when I use this model. And you don't have to answer each question. You can cherry pick the questions that are relevant to you. That's how I use the model anyway, and that's really worked well for me. And then sometimes it can be helpful when you have picked maybe 3 or 4 questions to answer. Well, why didn't I pick the other questions? Well, why didn't I feel that they were relevant? Why didn't I want to answer them? So that can be really helpful as well, to think about how you're using the model and which questions. So that's the what. I'm not expecting you to be able to write all this down very quickly. This video will be available afterwards as well. And if you're a member of the Facebook group, I'll mention it later. I will make sure that there's a template available for you to be able to use this model in your own practice. Moving on to the second element then, the so what. So all of these questions start with so what as well. So what does this tell me or teach me or imply? Or what does it mean about me? What does it mean about clients, others, our relationships, the model of care that I'm using, my attitudes, clients' attitudes? Lots of questions. What was going through my mind when I acted? You know, what are those thoughts that were going through my mind when the situation was happening? So what did I base my actions on? Was it based on theory? Was it based on a discussion that I had in supervision? You know, some guidance that you'd received? Was it based on evidence-based guidelines or practice? What did you base your actions on? So what other knowledge can I bring to the situation? Again, can you bring evidence-based guidelines in? Can you bring your services policy in? Can you bring some trust values in? Would that maybe help? Or can you bring in, other psychological models? What other knowledge do you have from your experience that you can bring to the situation? So could or should I have done what could I have done to make it better? So what should I have done to make it better? How can you improve the situation? This bit is about thinking, reflecting on the situation and thinking about what to do next time this happens. So what is my new understanding of the situation? What do I now think about the situation now it's happened? And this can be a really helpful model when you are reflecting kind of retrospectively. So I didn't really do a lot of reflection in my previous roles, but I've got quite a lot of things to reflect on. So this is a really helpful model to help me reflect on that, because you kind of have a bit of distance from the situation and you can kind of look at things slightly more objectively than if you were in that situation. I hope that makes sense. So it's quite a good one if you're thinking about, God, what was my first ever clinical experience, and was it messy or sticky, and why? And it's quite a good one to use. And the last one in this is, so what broader issues arise from the situation? Think really broadly. It might be something in society. There's things about representation for people, poverty, the social graces. What broader issues are important here? Power, threat, meaning, all of these different models that you can bring in. And what this is, it builds on the first part of the model, which is the what. So you've got what the issue was, what the problem was, what the difficulty was. And now you're kind of analysing it, and you're kind of looking at it in a different way and from different angles and seeing how it looks from all these different angles. That's kind of the purpose of this bit of the model. And now we come on to the last bit of the model, which is the now what. So it's all about taking what you've learned from this reflection and applying it to future practice. So the questions in this section are, now what do I need to do in order to make things better, or to stop being stuck, or to improve client care, resolve the situation, feel better? Now what do I need to do with this knowledge that I've got from this reflection? Now, what broader issues need to be considered if this action is to be successful? It's all very well having things in our own practice that we want to change. But if that, for example, doesn't go against, if it goes against your service policy, then that's very difficult. For example, I'll give you a very brief example. In my last role, I was working in substance misuse, and we were quite often asked to provide letters of support for people, going through the whole benefit universal credit system, which is needlessly difficult anyway. And it was a company policy that we did not provide those letters, even though us as professionals are really well placed to be able to do that. So one of my things that I could learn from this reflection might be actually what I need to do to make things better is to provide this support for my clients, because it's such essential things that they need. They don't have any other access to money, and money literally, what can you do without money nowadays? Nothing. So it would have made such a difference to those clients to feel like they had someone in their corner as well. But broader issue, it was not something we could do in our policy. It just wasn't something that was allowed. So now what I would do, I would challenge that all the way to the top that it needed to be, because I think it was a silly rule and needlessly pointless. Like, I just don't think it was required. Anyway, so what this is doing is really encouraging you to consider the broader issues that are around in your service, in the town that you're in the city that you're in the culture, the society. All of those things you need to consider. The next one is, now what might be the consequences of this action? Because it's thinking about, well, if I'm going to make this change to my practice, what are the consequences of that? It's really helping you think about making a decision and considering the consequences. So those are the questions. That is the model, basically. Very broad, 3 points: what, so what, now what. So when you're in an interview, I'm not suggesting that you remember all these questions and try and answer them all, because you will not be able to. But what is useful is the structure. What, so what, now what. That is the most important thing, and that's a really good way to structure interview answers. So we are going to move on to an example. As I say, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat anyway. The first example I want to talk to you about is, I've titled it AP Imposter Syndrome. So I imagine lots of us are very familiar with imposter syndrome, feeling like we're an imposter and we're going to get found out. And I think that's rife within clinical psychology. Particularly when I became an assistant, I had been trying for 4 long years to become an assistant, and never got there. So when I got that position and I was getting ready to leave the role that I was in, where I knew everything about the job, I knew the job back to front, and I could do it in my sleep virtually, although it was demanding in other ways. I knew the job, to going to a job that I tried to get all my life, pretty much, and consistently been told that I wasn't good enough to get the position. And now suddenly someone's taken a chance on me, and what if I'm not good enough? And that was a real issue. So I thought it was really interesting to reflect not only on that time between the jobs, where I was super nervous about starting as an assistant, because it's like this mighty position where you're going to learn everything and become a psychologist, and where I am now, and to reflect on that, really. I thought it would be interesting. So using our structure, what then? Well, what I found is that I felt like I didn't fit in because I wasn't qualified or experienced enough. And I think lots of this comes from us being unqualified members of staff. I'm sure lots of you will experience that. We might have good undergraduate degrees from really good universities. We might have a master's degree. Some might even have PhDs, and we're still not qualified. So that constant message that we're not qualified members of staff, compared to, for example, nursing colleagues who do their degree and then they become a registered nurse. I think that just reinforced how I felt about the whole situation, really. I didn't want to look stupid. I wanted to prove myself that I was worthy of this magnificent assistant position. And I was absolutely terrified, because lots of the other assistants I was working with just seemed so competent and confident and knowledgeable. And I just felt like I was not good enough really inside. I just felt, oh my God, I don't want to say anything because I'll look stupid and they'll all realise that I'm not qualified enough to be an assistant and I'll never become a clinical psychologist. And it's that, basically. That is the thought process in my head. And then when it comes to supervision, which is a big part of an assistant role, and I think that's why assistants tend to get onto the doctorate and why that has been perpetuated, that message, is because of that supervision. But I was really concerned about being open and honest about how I was feeling, you know, and I was just so nervous that my supervisor would turn around and say, yeah, you're right, you're not good enough, and you have 4 weeks, here's your 4-week notice. Which is a massive barrier to effective supervision, actually. If you don't feel that you are able to be completely open and honest, which takes time, I appreciate, then you're never going to achieve what you know the effective supervision that you can have if you feel ready to talk about this stuff. So that was the problem. That's the what element of it. Thinking about so what then, so the analysis section of the reflective model, my anxiety basically had become unhelpful. It had become massively unhelpful. It made me not want to speak in meetings. It made me, it just made me not want to engage with any sort of, professional discussion. It just became unhelpful, became a massive barrier. And then I think about different systems, different models that I can use. So anyone who's watched any of my recent videos knows that I'm very into compassion focused therapy at the moment. And basically, my threat system was activated, massively activated. I felt very, very stressed a lot of the time because I felt under threat and my anxiety was there. Looking at CBT, which is obviously a model that we all know, I was having lots and lots of anxious thoughts, wanted to avoid the situation, and that just became a vicious cycle, and it doesn't help. The whole situation does not become helpful in this. And the other thing that is important is that trusting people that's the most important thing, really. Being able to trust your supervisor, have that trust there, is really important. Moving on to the now what. Basically, what I've learned is that reflective models and journaling helps me process my experiences and my anxiety. It really helps ground me and make sense of the way that I'm feeling and validate the fact that my anxiety is a thing. And that naming this in supervision is helpful and meaningful. It leads to better practice generally. It leads me to be more reflective and to be more self-aware, which is super important in clinical practice. And there's more personal and professional development. If anyone is interested in sort of imposter syndrome and things like that, I recently entered a writing competition with the BPS, and an article was published in the March 2021 issue, and I'll link that down below as well if you're interested in reading a little bit about my imposter syndrome and how that is for pre-qualified psychologists, because I think it resonates with a lot of people. It's absolutely not just me, which is helpful to know. I have noticed a couple of questions coming in, and I'm going to leave them to the question and answer section, so thanks guys for popping those in. Moving on to the second example that I want to give you, which might touch on one of the questions actually. This is an issue, communication issues, and I've touched on this example before when I was working with someone with autism spectrum disorder, quite severely autistic, and learning disabilities, and I was very anxious. So the situation was that actually I was becoming really highly anxious in situations where communication was difficult, and for me that involves people with autism, potentially learning disabilities, dementia, sometimes children, like young children with mental health issues sometimes. I felt really out of my comfort zone. I felt like I wasn't able to make any adaptations because I just didn't feel competent. And I, wanted to be seen as competent. And absolutely, the last reflection, thinking about imposter syndrome, comes into this as well, don't get me wrong. But that was the sort of situation. I realised that through lots of different experiences, I felt very uncomfortable. And actually, to an extent, I still do feel very nervous and uncomfortable about situations where communication is difficult. That's what prompted this reflection. Then we move on to the so what section. And in the so what section, we talk about sitting with uncertainty and discomfort, and that is challenging. That's one of the biggest things that I've learned from being an AP, being in supervision, is that actually this is something that I don't do particularly well, and this is something I need to manage. And that I have a tendency to internalize when things go wrong. I have a tendency to blame myself, basically. I have a tendency to just be very anxious and blame myself, rather than thinking objectively about, okay, well, maybe I'm just not, I don't have the skills yet in this, and that's fine. It's nothing to do with me as a person, but that's the tendency I have. So differences in my personal and professional selves as well. So out of work, I'm pretty confident. I'm pretty confident doing this sort of thing. But when I'm in work, it's just like a different thing. I don't know what it is. It's different. Moving on to the now what then in this example. So what am I going to do with all this information? Well, I'm going to continue to reflect on future issues with communication and my thoughts and feelings. And I think this is particularly helpful for, hopefully, if I get any doctorate interviews this year, because they're not looking for you to be perfect. It's a training role. What they're looking for is some self-awareness. So I think having reflected on some of the issues that I've had previously, and the ability to reflect on that, not, as reflective practice, and to be self-aware, but the ability to have some confidence in saying, actually, I think this is an issue for me. I think this is what I want to work on. Is important. I also am trying to allow myself to notice things non-judgmentally and not think that it's immediately my fault if something goes wrong, or something is difficult, or something doesn't go as I planned it in my head. And I'm also trying to apply, more psychological theory and models as well. I hope this helped. Those are a couple of examples to just show you what I mean by this. And hopefully you can see from the examples that I've used what I call sticky cases. They are cases where there are some difficulty. It's not one of those that's just where everything goes right. Hopefully it helps. I'm going to move on to the critique before we get into the question and answer section. So have a think of some questions while I'm talking about the critique. In terms of some strengths then, for me, this is just my critique. This is not, a be all and end all. You'll have your own perception of this model and your own experience of using it. So some of the strengths, it's really fitting for situations that feel messy or sticky. It's good for those difficult situations that you just kind of need to think about and get into and have lots of questions about. It has a clear structure. What, so what, now what. Really clear. There is a plan sort of section included as well. The now what, how are you going to apply all of this reflection and this knowledge. There's lots of prompts, and prompts, that consider wider issues, perspective and theory as well. It's good for retrospective reflections, as I've said as well. Some of the limitations as I see it though, are there too many prompts? Is it difficult to know which prompts to focus on? Yes, I think it can be. I think to overcome that though, you just need to think of a really clear situation or set of situations that you want to reflect on. And then I think you kind of know what you need to get out of it. If it's feeling too overwhelming, you don't have to do it. There are lots of other models that you can use that are slightly simpler. It can take some significant time. This is one that, there are lots of different ways of reflecting. You don't always have to sit down and write a journal entry or sit down and write something. You don't always have to do that. It can take lots of significant time. But this is one for me that I think, okay, I feel a bit icky about this. Let me sit down and think about it. This is one that I'll sit and I'll write and I'll think about it for quite a long time. So yeah, it can take a significant time. Is it too structured? Possibly. Again, it's kind of too many questions and too many prompts. And it is better to be written down. So if writing a reflection down doesn't sit with you, that's fine. Just use a different model. That's absolutely fine. Let me know if you guys have got any other strengths and limitations that you found from using this model as well. Pop it down in the comments. That'd be great. Moving on to our question and answer. As I've said, absolutely pop your questions in the chat. That'd be great. But I have had one beforehand, which is so helpful when you guys send me questions before the webinar. That really helps me. So the question I had was, can you use this model just using the headings? So what, now what? Or do you have to use all the prompts? Well, as I've sort of touched on, you don't have to use all of the questions. You don't have to use any of the questions if that's not something you want. But lots of different models will use what, so, what, now, what, like the Driscoll model, which doesn't have any prompts. It's just that. So if you are just going to use what, so, what, now, what, looking at the Driscoll stuff might be a little bit better, a bit more fitting. So yeah, you can. If you find the prompts difficult, then maybe think about why. That's an interesting reflection in itself. Think about, actually, is it just because I'm not ready to reflect on this experience? Is it that I just, haven't processed it properly yet? Or is it because the model doesn't fit me? Would this reflection be easier using a different model? That's my answer to the question, really. Do what works for you. And I know that's really difficult advice to listen to, because if you're not quite sure what is right for you, then that can be really difficult. But just keep trying lots of different things. Just keep trying them. That's my advice. So a couple of questions that I've had in. Thank you so much, guys. I would like to ask regarding a topic regarding LGBT, how we can reflect that in a way they received care. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, I think it's important to think about you personally and where you sit, potentially, with your sexuality. You've got to remember that these reflections are personal for you. No one else needs to know that you're doing them. It's like a diary. No one else needs to know. So what I think would be helpful is, thinking about where you sit in terms of your sexuality, whether you identify as LGBTQ+, whether you identify straight, whether you're part of the more represented group, which would be sort of the straight group, I suppose. How you felt working with someone who identified as LGBTQ+. What situation you're in, I suppose, is important as well, because if you're working in a gender dysphoria clinic, then LGBTQ+ issues are far more important, I would say, and more salient than if you're working, I don't know, on a cancer ward, for example, if you're working in a physical health setting. So I would think about where you sit. The social graces model is really helpful for that. I have done a video, so I'll make sure that's down below as well. Think about where you sit. Think about the wider context of your service and whether LGBTQ+ issues are a really central part of the client experience. I mean, the other thing I could suggest is looking at literature. Looking at different research studies and papers and seeing how they receive care, and see if that's different. Maybe you could do a service evaluation. Maybe you could do something within your service that looks at how people from LGBTQ+ backgrounds experience your service and receive care. I hope that helps answer your question anyway, but thanks for popping that in there. And I've also had someone that says that was a great question. It was. What would you say about adaptations working with people with autism spectrum disorders? Yeah, so as I sort of mentioned earlier, I have fairly limited clinical experience working with people with ASD and LDs. And actually, like the whole idea of it actually makes me really anxious already. Just thinking about it. I suppose what I would say about adaptations with ASD LDs is to look at the research, look at the evidence-based guidelines, see what the guidelines are, look at some research that's coming out, join some support groups, join some special interest groups around, seek supervision from someone who knows, or speak to an ASD or LD service, and they might be able to guide you. Those are the main things I can say at the moment, because I'm not brill at this. I haven't got a lot of experience in working with ASD and learning disabilities, I'm afraid. But I hope that kind of helps in some way. I would definitely encourage you to seek support from people who do know. So thank you for asking the question anyway. Now I'm going to move on to our summary, because I haven't had any other questions in. But please feel free to pop some questions in, and I can always come back to it as we go on. So in terms of a summary then, reflective models can help us think about experiences in different ways, and I highly encourage you to start using some reflective models if you don't already in your practice. This model, the Rolfe et al. Model, is a good model for situations where you feel stuck. and also where you've got some time to be able to dedicate to this reflection. And I would encourage you to use it as part of a reflective portfolio, which is nothing fancy. It sounds fancy, but essentially it's just a collection of reflections and things that you find interesting. That's essentially what it is. So that summarises it. Let's look at our upcoming webinars. Now, our March webinar is, I don't want anyone to get too excited, but we are going to be looking at reflecting in a doctorate interview. So as you all know, I'm currently an assistant. I have interviewed twice for the doctorate. And I'm also going to be asking some people that are on training for some advice as well on how to reflect in a doctorate interview. So please join us for that. Fingers crossed for you all if you are waiting to hear back whether you've got interviews. I absolutely hope that you have if you have applied this year. And then in April we will be looking at a model of supervision, which is kind of different for us because we've always looked at reflective models, but we're going to look at a supervision model, so that should be interesting. Yes, so I've just had another question. It's a reply. Thank you so much. So also could look at the minority stress model for LGBTQ+ issues. Is this a model you might have covered? I've not seen that model before, so that's really helpful. Thanks. Maybe I will do another video on it. That's really helpful. Yeah, so that suggestion for anyone who missed it was the minority stress model, which sounds like it could be really useful in the current climate. So thank you so much for that. It's not one I personally used. Okay, how to get involved if you want to. We have got a Facebook group. It's a lengthy title, I appreciate, but it's the UK Declan Psy Applicants Reflective Space. And on there will be all templates and webinar information. Okay, so there will be a template available for this model that you'll be able to download and you'll be able to use in your own reflective portfolios. It's free to join. May as well come join us on there. We've got nearly 1,000 people. Come and join us, and hopefully there'll be a bit of space for people to discuss, interview prep and how to reflect it and things like that. As I say, we had, when I wrote this, we had 800 plus, but obviously as we're coming around to doctorate time, we've gone up to nearly 1,000. So fingers crossed we get there. That'd be great. And there is also a mentorship program available on there as well. So not only do I need mentorees, I need mentors. I need people that want to do both. So absolutely come and join us on there. Follow us on all the social medias down below. You'll see it there. And thank you so much for watching. I hugely appreciate it when anyone logs in to come to these live webinars. While we're in lockdown, I understand that more of you might be available, but I really appreciate it. And thank you if you're watching the recording as well. I will make sure that I link the videos down below. So thank you so much. And I will see you next month. Fingers crossed for you all, waiting for feedback on your applications. Thank you and take